Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret histories and little-known fascinating facts and figures behind your favorite movies, music, TV shows, and more. We are your two major dudes of minutia. I'm Alex Heigl, because any major dude will tell you. And we are those major dudes.
That's one of the best ones yet. I am Jordan Runtagh, and I am floored by that intro.
Oh, man.
Wow.
I was trying to think of how many Steely Dan references I could cram into this. Much like Brooklyn, you owe the charmer under me? I don't know. We could have gone with Kings there. We could have gone with Dirty Works. I guess all my references are very Can't Buy a Thrill heavy.
Oh, yeah.
Bodhisattvas of boring facts.
Wow, that's okay. Wait, might need to punch that one in. That's also very good.
Well, folks, as you may have gleaned from that preamble, we are talking about one of the best albums from one of the best bands of a very specific ilk. A truly high water mark of musicianship, songwriting craft, and studio production from a band who named themselves after a sex toy in Naked Lunch. That's right, folks. We are talking about Steely Dan's Asia. I personally love Steely Dan. Took me a long time to do it, though. Kind of verboten in the punk rock circles that I cut my proverbial teeth in. This is like a third-hand story. There's this guy in a record shop in Brooklyn. Shout out to Human Head Records. Everyone, if you're in New York,
Check
go
it
to
out.
Human Head. Or check
Great
them out on
store.
Discogs. I think they're also on Discogs. Anyway, this guy told me this story about he had a friend of his, I guess, who would go into record stores, buy Steely Dan records. I guess like Can't Buy a Thrill or one of the ones that was like cheaper before like the vinyl boom, and you know everything costs $25 now, but like back when you could get Steely Dan records for like $3 to $5, and he would pay for them at the counter, pull them out of the sleeve, break them in half, and leave them on the counter and walk out of the store.
So that is the prevailing mood of
Yes.
how people view Steely Dan
if you were
in
into
your
punk
musical
rock,
ilk. Okay.
Yep, that was the mood. But I mean,
That's horrifying
You
to
know.
me, frankly.
well, now I'm hook, line, and sinker. The jazz nerd musicianship and the laser focused production and songwriting are the just the perfect foil to the densely literate and misanthropic. They're so mean.
They are
Donald
very
Fagen
mean.
is so mean.
Yeah.
And the discerning Too Much Information listener will pick up a thread that I have about being just heinously bitter towards like being a musician in late stage capitalism where there's no damn money and no resources to do anything. And
Me, on the other hand, who played bass in your band, just happy to be there.
well, yeah, I mean, but for some reason, like where I get mad at like David Crosby for being like, I blew through $70 million in the 80s and now I'm pissed off I don't have any money. Like that rankles me. But for some reason, Steely Dan, I'm like, it's perfectly cool that you spent a week searching for one guitar solo while burning through LA's top guitarists and just telling them, nope, not it. Next. Like that's hilarious to me. No one will ever get to make records like that again. I guess
true.
maybe you could do it in your living room if you're not but
If you don't
like,
care about making friends.
I mean like Capitol Studios, like you're like, yep, this is costing us $500 a day.
A day,
Bring in the
more like
next
an
guy.
hour. Come on.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. I don't know. Adjusted for inflation? What about you, buddy?
I'm stunned that there was ever a period when you weren't a massive Steely Dan devotee. I mean, it's a couple of jazz dorks with chips on their shoulders and an unlimited budget. I mean, that just seems like, I just assumed you were jealous of anything. I mean, geez.
Well, yeah, it's that.
Yeah,
It's very
okay.
much that.
All right, good. I loved Steely Dan since I was in middle school, which, as you can imagine, may be immensely popular in 2001. I think I heard reeling in the ears on like oldies radio, and that led me to check out their greatest hits. And then
do it again pretty constantly. They're like the war horses.
And then going to their greatest hits, and then going through my dad's record collection at that point and seeing that he had most of the records. And I loved this stuff so much. I mean, I remember listening to Kid Charlemagne and Deacon Blues or something and thinking, like this is what perfect music sounds like. It was incredible. And I gotta say, as I got older, the precision almost started to grate on me ever so slightly. And I feel like that's a common criticism for Steely Dan's detractors. It's almost sterile.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I like Can't Buy a Thrill, because that's when they're like young and hungry,
and a real band as opposed to just Becker and Fagan. Yeah, my only knock against them is that it's just the sterility. And I mean, this is not a new observation. I think there was the New York Times critic Robert Palmer who said that Steely Dan's music sounded like it had been recorded in a hospital ward, which is a great diss. I mean, Asia in particular, I think it's just so smooth and clear that I get sometimes kind of a bit of the uncanny valley vibe from it, which is somewhat offset by Donald Fagen's voice and his hilariously specific lyrics, which I feel like go underappreciated way too often. We'll talk about them in this episode. I'm reminded of this quote from Roger Daltrey, which he says in like basically every documentary that he's a talking head in. It just sums up his approach to music. Give me a bum note and a bead of sweat any day. And obviously I love Steely Dan and have for many years, but sometimes I do have the sense that you don't hear the sweat. Although it's obviously there. Again, like you said, spending a week to cycle through all the top session guitarists in LA just to nail a single solo. But more often I hear the cocaine. I mean, I just assume that they're gacked out of their minds in this era. I actually don't know much about their... Well, I think that their producer did say that it was a drug-free zone in the studio, so I don't know.
Well, I think Fagen at one point talks about, I think the biggest stress on their like partnership at one point was Walter Becker opioids, I thought.
I forget what he struggled with substance abuse during the Gaucho era. I don't know what.
It was reportedly heroin.
Oh, damn.
His girlfriend overdosed in their apartment in 1980. Yeah, good Lord. He was hit by a taxi in 1979.
Whoa,
God
was
damn.
that what started it? Did he have painkillers for recovering from that?
Know. Wow. That's wild.
Damn.
Anyway. Well, from the mind-boggling array of 20th century music royalty involved in these sessions to the amount of days the vocalist spent perfecting a single two-word phrase on this record, to Asia's surprising second life as a treasure trove of hip-hop samples, here's everything you didn't know about Steely Dan's Asia. Asia Jin, like origin. Anything there? Yes, and talking about Steely Dan, talking about Steely Dan, we're really talking about the partnership between guitarist Walter Becker and singer-keyboardist Donald Fagen. Becker and Fagen played together in a variety of bands while at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York, one of which was called the Bad Rock Group and included Chevy Chase on drums. There's this amazing Rolling Stone profile from 1977 by Cameron Crowe in Rolling Stone. And he asks him about Chevy Chase, and Don Fagen just says, "We don't remember him." Which begins one of the many through lines of this episode, which is Donald Fagen being mean to people.
In the most subtle way.
They later moved to Los Angeles, staff writing for ABC Dunhill Records, and then you mentioned earlier that they had formed as a live band. They discard the band, and they begin this habit of just being like, well, who are the best people at these respective instruments in the country, and how can we get them onto this record and break their spirits?
It's very Phil Spector-esque when he would just have people play for hours and hours and hours to break down any shred of individuality in their playing.
Like boot camp.
Yep.
I'm just imagining Arlie Ermy now in the studio being like, "Damn it, maggot! Take that solo again and lean less on the mixolydian tonality. You f***ing sample." Just
it's a B flat 7 flat 9.
Maggot. Anyway, they wrote a song for Barbra Streisand that came out before Can't Buy a Thrill came out before any of their records. I Mean to Shine. Do you know that song?
No, never.
You strike me as a Streisand guy.
I'm not very
He
much.
said
no.
hatefully.
Yeah, that was uncalled for.
Enemy of the pod,
Yeah.
Barbra Streisand. 1972's Can't Buy a Thrill, which is just jam-packed with bangers. You've got Do It Again, Dirty Work, Kings, Reelin' in the Years, Brooklyn Owes the Charmer Under Me. That record establishes them as just this incredible songwriting team. They were able to just sculpt bands, bend bands to their will. And one of the biggest, I don't know if he's unsung, but one of the biggest heroes is this founding member, Denny Diaz, on guitar, who technically was one of the founding members. He put an ad in 1970 in the Village Voice reading, looking for keyboardist and bassist, must have jazz chops. Holes need not apply.
So Fagan and Becker lied.
Yeah, right. Also for around this time is Jeff Skunk Baxter, just one of the most tremendously facial-haired guitarists of this time, and also a missile defense contractor for the government. Oh, I love that so much. Did you know that?
Afterwards? Wow.
Yeah.
I did not.
It's like if Michael McDonald was like a CIA spook, like destabilizing South American governments. Just garroting Banana Republic dictators and being like, oh.
I'm just sort of amazed that anybody in the music industry could get security clearance and pass a background check. Right? Like, yeah. I got to gush about Reelin' in the Years. That solo by Elliot Randall is just incredible. According to, I forget if it was Becker or Fagan, there was an even better one that he did before the tape was rolling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's perfect. It's perfect. It's notably one of the few things that Jimmy Page has ever said complimentary about rival musicians. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant were both big Little Feat fans, but Jimmy Page has gone on like repeatedly on record as being like, the Reelin' in the Years solo is like my favorite guitar solo of all time.
That makes sense. He's an ex-session player. I feel like he would appreciate that. I don't know. Elliot Randall, the guy who played it, would later describe his experience working with Steely Dan. Instruction? What instruction? The only constant would be Walter Becker coming over to me right before the assistant hit the red button and saying, "Play the blues, Elliot."
There's a tweet that came out right around the Get Back documentary that was like, I need an 8-hour documentary of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker chain smoking at a mixing console and just telling session guitarists, nope, that's not it. Anyway, they followed Can't Buy a Thrill with Countdown to Ecstasy, Pretzel Logic, Katie Lied, and The Royal Scam before arriving at today's topic, 1977's magnum opus, Asia. They had stopped touring in 1974 because they simply did not like it, and they didn't tour again for 19 years.
It was basically the same approach taken by the Beatles and Brian Wilson, who, it must be noted, by the time they stopped touring, had way more hits than Steely Dan. But yeah, I guess they just wanted to become a studio entity. Once a journalist asked Donald Fagen how they'd managed not to tour, and he said, easy, we fired all the roadies so we couldn't go.
I think XTC too, right? Did
yeah.
When they like,
I don't even know if they ever
anymore.
quit. I almost feel like they just only were in the studio. I think so.
I recommend everyone watch classic albums is such a weird bummer to me that I feel like that series goes on and off streaming constantly. Like I remember there was a point where they were on Prime and I watched all of them.
Oh, they're not anymore? That's a bummer.
I watched this on YouTube. Anyway, the classic album series are incredible. The Steely Dan Classic Albums episode is a must-watch. And in it, Donald Fagen says, around the time we made Asia, we figured out what it was we sort of wanted to do, musically. We realized we needed session musicians who had a larger palette of things they could do, who were also good readers, because they were coming in cold. To that end, Asia's liner notes basically read like a yearbook superlative page of mid-century jazz, R&B, soul icons, LA session vets. Let's just run them down. And again, I'm only using their biggest accomplishments as a calling card. These guys' Wikipedia pages are incredible. Drummers, Paul Humphrey, played on Let's Get It On by Marvin Gaye. Also played with iconic jazz guitarist Wes Montgomery. Short list of the greatest tenor saxophone players of all time, John Coltrane, short list of the greatest jazz bassists of all time, Charles Mingus. This guy replaced Buddy Rich at
That's
one point.
insane.
And he was the drummer for the Lawrence Welk Orchestra, which feels like kind of a come down after I named all those other things.
He probably got
he was in
paid
that
more,
for
though.
6 years. That's true. Steve Gadd, the true drummer's drummer. Among his many, many accomplishments is the drum intro to 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover by Paul Simon. The guy is he's played with every famous musician of the 20th century. It's quicker to name people he hasn't played with. Bernard Pretty Purdy. I can't say enough great things about Bernard Pretty Purdy. He's one of the most famous sessions of all time. He created the Purdy Shuffle, which has been adopted by everyone from John Bonham on Fool in the Rain to Toto for Rosanna. There's a great story that Donald Fagen tells in the 60s. Bernard Purdy would show up to a session with 2 signs that he would set up on either side of his drum kit. One would read, "You done it. You hired the hit maker," and the other would have his name on it, Bernard Purdy. The problem was with him, as Fagen explained to Don Breithopt in the extraordinarily, perhaps to its peril, comprehensive 33 1/3 entry for Asia, his first or second take would be perfect. So while everyone else was still figuring out the changes, Bernard would put on his overcoat and say, "That's it, I'm going home," just to overdub the other guys. It's funny because Jeff Berner at Brooklyn Studio G, who I've worked with, had been in sessions with Bernard Purdy.
What?
And he was like, "That guy costs $1,200 a song, and he does not like doing second takes."
That's incredible. Wow. He also claimed to be the ghost drummer on early Beatles tracks, like thickening up Ringo's parts, which seems like a crock.
Yeah,
I'm guessing.
if you're like the kind of dork, and I say this as one of them, who has spent time on the Steve Hoffman forums,
Yes.
which is
yes.
almost certainly the greatest repository of like white guy boomer musicians in the world. Hashtag Rick Beato. Beato.
It makes Twitter
Yeah.
look like a land of civil discourse. Let me put it that way.
It is just, I mean, the people are still arguing about Bernard Purdy, who I guess has just claimed to drum on everything. But yeah, I mean, you should just look up some videos of him because he's hilarious. Have you seen the one where he's explaining the Purdy Shuffle and he's like, "And then I discovered some air in my hi-hat."
Oh, yeah.
Psh, psh, psh. And then he starts singing his drum fills. Oh, hey, ha, ho, ho, hey, ha, ha. Anyway.
But it's triple and halftime, right? Triplets and halftime. That's what basically what a bird. Yeah.
With all the little you put all the little ghost notes in the snare. And anyway, we're barely through drummers. Rick Marotta, another legendary session player who's played with everyone from Aretha Franklin to Waylon Jennings. This guy also composed the music for Everybody Loves Raymond. So 1 degree of separation between Steely Dan and Everybody Loves Raymond. Ed Green played with Three Dog Night, Dizzy Gillespie, Jeff Beck, Diana Ross, can be heard in some of Barry White's biggest hits. Jim f***ing Keltner, probably the most famous session drummer of the 20th century. Just look at his Wikipedia page. My favorite Jim Keltner anecdote is that also on the classic album series, I think it's Tom Petty talking about it. They were recording Refugee, and they were just like banging their heads again. Or maybe it's Jimmy Iovine who talks about it. Either way, they were like getting frustrated trying to record Refugee, and they were like, this song still needs something else. And one of them, frustrated, they like open the door to the control room and they step out in the hallway, and Jim Keltner's standing there with an egg shaker, which is the little auxiliary percussion thing that's filled with like little beads, and he's just sitting
It looks
there
like
in
a silly putty case, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He's sitting there in the hallway and he's like, "You know what that song really needs? A shaker part." And damn it, he was right. So they brought him in and he plays the shaker part, and Refugee sells 17 million copies or whatever.
And Keltner gets his day rate.
I was going to say, yeah. Ugh. Also in the Asia cut Josie, Keltner plays a garbage can lid as percussion. Buried somewhere away in the mix. You can hear it soloed at one point on the classic albums thing. Fagen, I think in the 33 1/3 says it was his idea. He said, "We were in awe of him. So anything he wanted to do was good. We didn't even think about it. We just said, quick, get Jim Keltner a garbage can lid. Which, yeah, when Jim Keltner asks for a garbage can lid, you bring it to him.
You bring the man a garbage can lid. Listening on the classic albums, Doc, listening to Becker and Fagan like dissect the tracks at the mixing board, it's really amazing all the weird sounds that they have in there that you don't hear, and then when you hear them isolated, you're just like, what the hell is that? But then they explain why they put it in there. Like there's this one part in, I think it was Peg, where they had this little really high trebly synthesizer, that sounds like a child's toy, or like something that would be played in like a mall in the 70s, like over like a Muzak track. It's this weird sound, and you hear it isolated. You're like, what the hell is that? Not only have I never heard that in there, but also why would anyone ever think to use that? And they explain, well, we thought that the horn parts needed a little more high end, so we put it on there to make it a little brighter, to make it just it's like an artist who puts shade or something to emphasize.
Well, it's like, I mean, you know what I'd say is like, it's like Rothko, like coming up with his own chemically unique washes to put over his paintings, where it's like, yeah, that's like 6 parts egg white to 3 part Elmer's glue and 1 part airplane glue, and then just painting it over all his stuff. And people today are still like, how do you do that? You know, they're big, like it just doesn't look the same. And that's the thing about this record, is that like it was for, I guess, a long period of time, the preferred demo album in high-end stereo shops. Like if you went in to buy like a $6,000 Marantz amplifier or whatever, someone would slap on Asia and be like, you really hear Jim Keltner's trash can part on this. Chuck Rainey plays bass on. This is a real testament to Chuck Rainey. You're gonna have to bleep so much of this. I just get so excited about Steely Dan. There's a real testament to Chuck Rainey. He's like one of the only bassists on here. I think maybe the only. It's like him and Becker.
Yeah, it was like Becker did some.
Possibly best known for his long association with Aretha Franklin. The guy has played on over 1,000 recordings. It's like him and Ron Carter and Milt Hinton, who are like the most recorded bassists of period. Full stop. The Peg story that's in classic albums, he thought the song's chorus needed a slap bass part, and Fagan and Becker, possibly because slap bass was kind of coming into vogue at the time. This is like right after, I mean, slap bass really only dates back to Larry Graham and Graham Central Station with Sly, but also around this time you're getting Brothers Johnson stuff. Louis Johnson is like a huge slap bass guy, so it was kind of coming into vogue around this time, and of course Becker and Fagan were like, no slap bass. So what Chuck Rainey's solution was to put up like an ISO
studio partition.
Studio partition, and turn on a rotating chair or stool slightly away from them so that they couldn't see his hands from the control booth, and play the slap bass part as he wanted.
I mean, you can tell, you can hear it through, I'm sure, the studio headphones. Like, it's obvious he's doing slap bass, but. And then he did it again on Josie, right? I know that's a slap bass part. Maybe that was an authorized slap bass part.
Rainey's amazing. I don't really understand his right hand technique. If you just like Google some of his YouTube videos, he just does unreal shit. And he's on another great example to watch him work or hear him work is the Aretha Franklin, The Amazing Grace. Keyboards. Donald Fagen plays a lot of keys on the record, but my God, dude, they have Victor Feldman, who wrote one of the most famous mid-period Miles Davis songs, 7 Steps to Heaven. He's on that record. He also plays percussion, he plays vibraphone, and that is his extremely prominent shaker part on Do It Again. But possibly my favorite Victor Feldman story is that during a session for the Royal Scam on the song Green Earrings, they relegated him to playing a container of salt as a percussion part for an entire day.
It seems like a punishment.
Well, I think in the Vulture, there's like a Vulture article about Steely Dan where they say it was a punishment because he was playing too, quote, out earlier. And so they were like, play the salt shaker.
Come back when you've chilled out.
Yeah. Other keysmen include sessionist Don Grolnick, a guy named Michael Omartian, who has won 3 Grammys, did the arrangement for We Are the World, And he played the accordion part on Billy Joel's Piano Man. A guy named Joe Sample, who founded the group Jazz Crusaders, played with a bunch of people. And you can hear his compositions on the Weather Channel, apparently, for many years. And Paul Griffin, who played with King Curtis, and also is on Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde and your beloved American Pie. Guitar-wise, we have jazz shred extraordinaires Larry Carlton, Lee Ritenour, Steve Kahn, and Dean Parks, along with multiple Grammy winner Jay Graydon, who, as far as I can tell, is the only guy on this list to have also made an appearance in the comic strip Doonesbury.
In what context?
No idea. It's just a note on his Wikipedia page. I don't know. What, do you expect me to have read Doonesbury in the past 20 years?
Like the first comic strip to win a Pulitzer? I expect more from you. You're a highly literate guy.
Oh, wow. I was always more of a Far Side guy.
That's
and
gas.
Calvin and Hobbes. Well, how did Calvin and Hobbes not win like a Nobel Prize? Whatever. Larry Carlton, in particular, was tasked with, he would get the demo tapes from Fagan and Becker and basically transcribe a lot of these parts into studio-ready charts for the other musicians, which sounds like a thankless job. On horns, you've got a member of the Blues Brothers. Tom Scott wrote the arrangements for this record in 2 weeks. Pete Christlieb, who plays saxophone on Deacon Blues, in one take, after arriving at the studio after already taping The Tonight Show, which he was a member of the band, and legendary jazzman Wayne Shorter, who played in Miles Davis's second great quintet, which will never cease to astound me that Miles Davis had two bands so good that they are referred to as the first and second great quintets, respectively, which also makes him the second Miles Davis sideman to appear on this record. Also, a guy named Plaz Johnson Jr., also known as the tenor saxophone soloist on the Pink Panther theme. Jim Horn of the Wrecking Crew played with Dwayne Eddy, George Harrison, John Denver on Pet Sounds, and also played
Plaz.
That's right. Yeah. And also played the iconic flute solo on Canned Heat's "Going Up the Country." 20-year veteran of the Tonight Show band, Bill Perkins, a trombonist named Dick Hyde, who, aside from having one of those insane, Dick Hyde, who had one of those insane Wikipedia entries, but he also won 4 MVP awards from the Recording Academy, like the Grammys.
I didn't know you
didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, he did it 4 times.
That's a thing, and he won it 4 times.
Maybe they retired it after him.
The 6th Man Award. A veritable army of backing vocalists, including the aforementioned GOAT of late 70s, early 80s soft rock vocalist Michael McDonald. Timothy B. Schmidt of the Eagles is on this.
Whoa.
Ex-Iket, Vanetta Fields, ex-Motowner and backup session warhorse Shirley Matthews, and Clyde King, who I didn't know anything about, and then I Googled her. In 1998, Bob Dylan's then-girlfriend, Susan Ross, alleged that Clyde King was the secret wife of Dylan and mother of 2 of his children. Do you know anything about this?
I know nothing about that. Has that been
I think it was just in the tabloid. No,
recognized?
I don't want to go on there. It was just in the tabloids or anything, but it's just funny to me. Anyway, Gary Katz worked with legendary producers and songwriters Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. What are the Lieber and Stoller greatest hits, Jordan? Locomotion, I know.
No, the Locomotion's Carole King.
Goff and King, yeah. Sorry.
Goff and King.
Stand corrected.
I mean, Hound Dog, Kansas City, Yakety Yak, Searchin', Young Blood, bunch of Elvis stuff, Jailhouse Rock, God, King Creole. I think they did Stand By Me. Yeah, I mean, tons of songs.
Katz also parallel career as an A&R guy. He signed Jim Croce, Shaka Khan, and Rufus. He signed Jimmy Buffett. Also Prince, Dire Straits, Christopher Cross, and Ricky Lee Jones to Warner Brothers. That's mind-boggling. In that Rolling Stone piece, Cameron Crowe says, the relationship with Katz continued as like a way of a setup, and Walter Becker says, why shouldn't it? He has a mustache. In the 33 and a third book, another perhaps unsung aspect of Katz's contributions were the fact that he could play this variation of the card game Rummy called Tonk that I guess the black studio musicians like knew, and they were Fagan and Becker were like terrified of, by their own admission, quote, terrified when like Chuck Rainey and Bernard Pretty Purdy came into the studio, and I guess Gary Katz was like, no, we're gonna play Tonk, and like really broke the ice. I love that. Anyway, with all of that talent at the extremely finicky Becker and Fagan's disposal, it is no wonder Asia took over a year to make, with 5 months spent on mixes alone. I would eat a bullet.
13 separate mixes, right? Something like that.
Good.
Over 5 months, 13 of them.
Forced ABC to reschedule the release date 3 times.
One of the session guitarists, Steve Kahn, later said that in order to get a track greenlit, it had to get the okay from Becker, Fagan, and producer Gary Katz. And he said to get a track past all 3 of them was next to impossible. If 2 liked it, 1 would veto it just to exercise his own sense of authority.
That's what you get for having an odd number of votes.
Yep.
Guitarist Dean Parks recalled the shape of these recording sessions for the Classic Albums episode. He said we would have 6-hour sessions, 2 3-hour sessions with a lunch break in between. We'd rehearse for the morning session, and I would have the distinct feeling that we would never get a take with this band. It would never happen. The song would probably not end up on the album, and it was all going to be failed. Pause. We'd go to lunch, come back, and everything was in place, and we get a lot of really good takes. Which is basically how I feel every work day between my lunch break and after.
Yeah.
Drummer Rick Murata said, you gotta love him. You go in there, and you're just really good friends, and you'll play, and you'll try to get into it, and you'll say, that's really good. And then the next day, somebody else is doing it. A whole other band. It wasn't like they played musical chairs with the guys in the band. They played musical bands. A whole band would go and a whole incredible other band would come in.
Can you imagine what a box set, like a true box set,
it would be insane.
Like a Brian Wilson Smile Sessions type thing would be with this, with all the different incarnations of the bands playing all these songs?
Because on the Classic Albums thing, they still have those takes saved, I guess, somewhere in the alts. They're like, there could be a year of this stuff.
Yeah. It'll be
Lee
some
Ritenour,
like Salinger type thing, like after Fagan goes. God.
Lee Ritenour told Breithaupt, amongst session players in LA, working on Steely Dan's stuff was a very big deal. You'd see guys at other sessions and they'd be asking, did your solo make it? But apparently they were never the axemen for this. They would always delegate the responsibility of telling these guys their solo didn't make it to Katz. Who I guess would soften the blows by like chatting them up about baseball and then at some point dropping in the bad news. Like, yeah, how about the Dodgers this year? By the way, that thing you spent 6 hours on is not making the cut. Dire Straits guitarist and vocalist Mark Knopfler, who's frequently cited by the middle-aged white guy readership of Guitar World as one of the greatest guitarists of all time, did not have a good time when the band asked him to play on Time Out of Mind from Gaucho. He recorded 10 hours plus of guitar work, only to have about 15 seconds of all of that make the song's intro.
I mean, honestly, that sounds like the correct ratio for Steely Dan. He described the experience as, quote, like getting into a swimming pool with lead weights tied to your boots. And I say, good. I hate Dire Straits.
That's one of your spicier takes.
Oh, I hate that band.
Speaking of Gaucho, is rumored that Jeff Porcaro is drummer for Toto, another widely well-regarded session drummers in history. He drums on the title track. That take is supposedly cut together from 46 separate takes. How do you comp a drum track from 46 takes? How long is the song Gaucho? Can't possibly be that. What is it? 3 cuts per second? 532.
I would assume they're playing to a click track.
Wow, yeah. Good God.
I mean, see, this is what I mean. It almost seems like their songs are perfect to the point where it almost seems like AI or something. Like it's a little unnerving at points.
Steve Kahn, who plays rhythm guitar in Peg, told Newsweek Having the money and the power of guaranteed sales is a license for abuse. He's correct. What they might waste on 1 or 2 days of recording to get a single track, most artists like me could make an entire record for that. He is correct.
I love how they spent all this money, like hundreds of thousands of dollars in the 70s, so more like millions in today's dollars, while steadfastly refusing to tour. It's no income stream other than record
back
sales.
Back in the day, the profit. I mean, nowadays everybody makes their only money on
Merch.
tour, but back in the day, tour and merch. Yeah, but back in the day, it was inverted. You would make all your money from radio and record.
I guess they actually considered touring Asia and got as far as rehearsals right before, and then they just scrapped the whole idea. Fagan later said, "We had $4,000 worth of musicians in the room, guys who wouldn't go out on the road for Miles Davis, literally, and they were committed to doing this. And we," meaning he and Becker, "left the room together and said, 'What do you say? You want to can it?' And we both said yeah without thinking twice."
Icons. As you meditate on that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information after these messages. We'll get to Peg. Well, we're getting to Peg right now. The band went through somewhere between 5 and 8 guitarists. Accounts differ, just for the solo on Peg, which wound up being played by Jay Graydon. Donald Fagen told Newsweek,
A rare display of shame.
"We were embarrassed for them and for us. We felt silly spending all this money for this one brief blues solo."
And yeah, I think we talk about this later. They listened to some of the outtakes for the guitar solo in the Classic Albums documentary, and just voices dripping with contempt. I mean, it's like they still 30 years later at that point, or 20 years later at that point, still hate what they're hearing. This is a silly aside, but Jay Graydon, the guy who ended up finally playing the right Peg solo, had a great quote about modern recording software, and this is in the Newsweek piece we've cited. Zach Schoenenfeld did an amazing job writing a piece just about the guitar solo in Peg. It's so great. Jay Graydon said, "Now you can make anything perfect in Pro Tools, but back then there was no help, man. Before Pro Tools, there were pros." Amazing.
Rick Derringer of Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo fame.
And Hang On Sloopy by the McCoys.
Mm-hmm. He was another candidate. An engineer on these sessions, Elliot Shiner, told Newsweek for the aforementioned article, "Rick Derringer was there for about 3 or 4 hours. We got something out of him. The minute he left..."
That's like they did a shakedown.
Yeah, right? "He was strapped to a chair. We put car battery up to his nipples, and he played this guitar solo for 4 hours." Anyway, he said, "The minute he left, Walter looked at me and said, 'Erase it.'"
Remove it from the earth.
That guy. I said, "Okay." You never questioned it. Apparently someone told Derringer this was a technical issue because in that Newsweek article, he says something about like, "Oh yeah, I heard the tape was corrupted," or something.
Like multiple times he says it.
But immediately after him in that article, the engineer is quoted in saying, "They tried to get what they wanted out of Rick and they didn't, so I erased it." So Rick Derringer, if you listen to Too Much Information, I'm sorry to break it to you, but they just really hated your guitar solo. It wasn't a problem with the tape. Jay Graydon said his solo took 4 or 5 hours to nail down. God love him.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, you got to watch this Classic Albums documentary and watch Becker and Fagan go through. I think they only play like 2 or 3 of the outtakes, but
and they don't name who's playing.
Right? No, but I mean
diplomatically.
Well, it's as close to diplomacy as they get.
Side note: I love Donald Fagen has the John Waters mustache.
Yeah,
for some reason.
He looks like John Waters' like pervy younger brother who's really into Chaz and like zoot suits. But yeah, during this, like they're playing all these rejected solos, and just the eye contact between the two of them, like you can tell they want so badly to rip it apart. And Fagan says, "Wouldn't you hate if someone did this to you?" And so finally, they get to the version that wound up on the record, and Becker says, and then Jay came in and did the solo with absolutely no difficulty whatsoever. Which is brutal. There's a great line about this in Winston Cook Wilson's incredible retrospective piece for Spin for Asia's 40th anniversary. He said, like their hero Duke Ellington, Fagen and Becker needed the identity of individual soloists to create their finished canvas, but within quite specific and refined structural limits. The duo, however, was not as good with people as Ellington, but they didn't have to be. From the safety of the studio booth, they could just say, try it again as much as they needed, and scrap the solos they didn't like after the fact. They were described somewhat more bluntly in Dylan Jones's 2014 piece for GQ UK as fundamentally sociopaths masquerading as benign dictators.
Incredible quote.
In the same piece, Becker said, we just kept adjusting our standards higher and higher. So many days we'd make guys do 30 or 40 takes and never listen to any of them again because we knew none of them were any good. But we just kept hoping that somehow it was just going to miraculously get good. I guess Fagen, I think, was so fastidious and fussy that people called him Mother behind his back in the studio.
For Michael McDonald, whose soaring multi-tracked vocals are the pillowy clouds that drape the chorus of Peg, having to be stuck in the booth for hours overdubbing his own voice into dense harmonies meant to mimic the horn section voicings of big bands, clearly an experience that still haunts him. Absolutely my single favorite section from that classic albums thing, which people on YouTube agree because they've just cut it out as an edit, is Fagen goes, let's check out his high part just to embarrass him. And Becker just goes, cool. So they just solo by going, Peg, back to you. Peg, it will come back to you. Yeah, it's wild, man. I mean, it's not even like barbershop stuff. It sounds like horn sections.
Yeah, it's like four-way close harmonies. It sounds like those old radio show jingle type stuff from the 40s or old silver screen era backing vocals.
Which is appropriate because it's all about like a faded broad, like a silver screen, silver age. What the am I trying to say? It's all about
silver
like a
screen
faded,
era.
Yeah.
Yeah,
actress.
Well, so that's the theory. So the theory is that it's about Peg Entwistle,
Yes.
who was, according to Hollywood Babylon lore, she threw herself off the H in the Hollywood sign because she couldn't get any work in the 20s or 30s, I forget. And the likely apocryphal coda to this is that she had an offer letter for a new part waiting in her mailbox at home that came like right after she left to go on this fatal journey. But yeah, given those old timey harmonies, that sound is like something out of a 1930s or 40s musical or radio jingles. I wouldn't doubt it, even though I guess Steely Dan have denied that it was written about a real person.
Yeah, Donald Fagen will always arrive to puncture your misconceptions. And as of 2020, he was saying, there's no hidden meaning. We just wanted a dotted half note for that spot, and Peg was short enough to fit with the music.
They wear their soullessness on their sleeves. I appreciate that.
Funnily enough, given that theme, the song was used as the theme music for a celebrity paparazzi segment by Entertainment Tonight on their televised show from 81 to 85.
I cannot imagine how that would fit, but that's really funny because in the Dylan Jones piece for GQ UK I mentioned a moment ago, they Becker and Fagen actually cite old school television music as one of their many influences. And it's actually a really illuminating passage in this piece, which maybe goes some way in explaining why they're so finicky with their music and what exactly it was they were looking for when they were recording. I think this is Fagen talking. He said, we were interested in a kind of hybrid music that included all the music we'd ever listened to, which is a high bar. So there were always a lot of TV music and things in there. It was very eclectic, and it used to make us laugh. We knew something was good if we would really laugh at it when we played it back. We liked the sort of faux luxe sound of the 50s. There was just something very funny about it. I grew up in a faux luxe household, and it was a very alienating world. So for me, it had the opposite effect. Muzak is supposed to relax you, but it makes me very anxious. I thought that was a very interesting insight into what motivates them creatively.
I think he said multiple times, he's like, I like real jazz and fake jazz. I guess he's talking about music when he says that. Muzak when he says that. That classic albums thing is so funny to me because if you watch him play piano, he has such a ridiculous, weird piano technique. He raises his arm up to like his shoulder to like drop it down and play these right hand parts. Which I guess it's actually I read something where he talked about how much he idolized Ray Charles, and and specifically he said specifically the physicality of watching Ray Charles play piano, where he was like, I'd never seen someone put their whole body into playing music that way. It's a weird digression. In the 33 and a third book, Bright helped pins down the rhyme scheme of Peg. There's double verse in that and I gotta really push my face up against my monitor to read this. A B C C D B A E C C D E. I think I said that right. Well, in Deacon Blues, verses 1 and 3 are A B C B D E F F E. Just in case you thought they were overly hard on the instrumentalists. I also love in Deacon Blues, there's a part in that classic albums where Fagan just goes, this was when I was singing a little like Jerry Lewis, listening to his own vocals. And Becker just goes, yeah, that was a very fertile period for you. It's their friendship is so like heartwarming. Their partnership is so heartwarming to me because it's just like these two guys who could clearly never, aside from I guess their wives, like never met anyone else they could bond with.
Very much so. Yeah,
and everyone just talks about them being able to like finish each other's sentences and obviously having this tremendously like fertile, musical partnership. But yeah, it's cute.
It is. And for all their technical virtuosity and brilliant songcraft, I feel like their lyrics are almost underappreciated, or at least the least appreciated of all their other gifts. I feel like these were two beatniks who studied English at Bard, so clearly they were extremely literate intellectual guys. And the journalist Chris Morris said in a piece for Variety, quote, the art school Dan Maestros drew on a wealth of literary inspirations for their lyrics, which dealt heavily in subterfuge and misdirection in the manner of a Times Square 3-card Monte game. I just thought that was such a great, intriguing way to put that. Their lines are as sarcastic and biting and vicious as any punk lyric. Fagan later said, we write the same way as a writer of fiction would write, assuming the role of a character. And considering they're named after a dildo in a William Burroughs novel, the beats obviously loom large. But Fagan was also a big sci-fi nerd. He was a member of the science fiction book club in school, which is adorable. And he identified with people who use sci-fi as social satire. People like C.M. Kornbluth or A.E. Van Voigt or Alfred Bester was his favorite. And a lot of these writers came out of the socialist movement of the 30s and used their writing to criticize society. And you can kind of see the sci-fi influence coming out on something like the opening lines of the title track, Asia, Up on the Hill. Can you do a Donald Fagen?
I actually can't. I didn't have one of these prepared.
Dora's going to be disappointed. Up in the Hill, they've got time to burn. There's no return. Double helix in the sky tonight. Throw out the hardware. Let's do it right. I mean, sounds like, I don't know what that sounds like, but see the sci-fi influence.
It's funny because William Gibson, who is the acknowledged father of the cyberpunk subgenre of sci-fi, I think has multiple Steely Dan references in his works. Yeah.
Oh. I mean, yeah, good luck figuring out what those opening lines in Asia mean. And even the opening line of Deacon Blues, this is the day of the expanding man. That's supposed to be a reference to Alfred Bester's book, The Demolished Man. And then another influence in Steely Dan's lyrics, you have the black comedy of authors like Terry Southern, who did The Magic Christian and Candy, Kurt Vonnegut, Philip Roth, and especially Vladimir Nabokov, familiar to most people as the author of Lolita. And he shares Steely Dan's fascination with unreliable narrators and creeps and perverts and obsessives who perform all kinds of mental gymnastics to justify their poor behavior. Nabokov's books are portraits of humans driven insane by passion. I mean, Humbert Humbert's probably the best example of that in Lolita. And you also have the Beats influence with the junkies and the criminal elements. It's all dark stuff. I mean, you got a little bit of Bob Dylan in there. In fact, I think Fagan lives, or at least lived, in Bob Dylan's old house in Woodstock.
I had no idea.
And Steely Dan have often cited the musical satirist Tom Lehrer as a major influence. He was a pianist satirist in the 50s and early 60s, and he would have songs like Poisoning Pigeons in the Park, The Old Dope Peddler, and also a song about the nuclear apocalypse called We Will All Go Together When We Go. And I just feel like all of those sound like Steely Dan song titles to me.
And National Brotherhood Week, which
Right.
is just a litany of racial prejudices, the refrain of which is, and everybody hates the Jews.
I mean, again, I feel like you can see all of these elements that show up in Steely Dan's lyrics. I read somewhere that many of the characters in Steely Dan songs seem like they should be sitting at the Nighthawks diner in that Hopper painting, just lonely and slightly sinister and morose, as if they've just poisoned pigeons in the park. Fagan would later admit that Steely Dan were obsessed with, quote, a culture of losers. And a good example of that's the character in Deacon Blues, this deluded wannabe jazz musician living out in the sticks. Ironically, they said that's the closest to an autobiographical song they ever had.
It's my theme song.
And then you get Black Cow, which seems to be about a man who may be stalking his ex-girlfriend who's pilled up and seeing a lot of men at the time. And it's basically a Nabokov character. This guy's stalking his ex. I think I have the meaning of that song right. I mean, their words are obviously notoriously dense. When the Farrelly brothers were making the comedy Me, Myself, and Irene in 2000, for some reason they wanted the soundtrack to just be all covers of Steely Dan songs. And they got people like Ben Folds and Wilco and Brian Setzer to contribute. The only person who turned them down was Jonathan Richman. And when the Farrelly brothers pressed him on, why, he said, Peter, I'd like to do this, but the lyrics, I don't know what they mean. I never understood what Becker and Fagan were saying. And he justifiably felt like he couldn't sing songs he didn't understand, so he passed.
Now we have to get into hashtag Beato, my favorite part of the Beato Music Corner, my favorite part of any TMI episodes. Steely Dan lean on this very specific voicing for their major chords, which they called the mu, or I guess mu. I don't know. I didn't take Greek. I was in a fraternity. It's the Greek letter. I don't know how you pronounce it.
M-U.
It is just basically a different way of voicing a major chord. Technically, it is a major 9 chord, because you add the second degree of the scale that the chord is drawn from and voice it in such a way that it creates 2 sets of whole tone intervals, one between the root of the chord and the major second, and one between the major second of the chord and the major third. So if you're in the key of C major chord, C, E, G, root, third, fifth, the mu voicing of that would be a C, D, E, G. The crucial difference here is that in like most jazz voicings of these chords, you see this chord tone added as a 9th. And what that means is that it's stacked above the rest of those intervals. So you would have a root, third, fifth, maybe a 7th, and then you would have the 9th above all of those. But what the Steely Dan voicing does is put that tone, that in this example, the D, the second of the chord, put that right in between the root and the third, and that creates this very dense texture that sounds like
almost dissonant.
I know because it's a whole tone, which is the first 3 notes of the whole tone scale, which comes from like Debussy and Ravel, Stravinsky. You hear Thelonious Monk use the whole tone scale a lot. And I guess it was their way of trying to make these major chords sound like a little more interesting without adding a bunch of other extensions and stuff to them. But I can't think of another pop band that has a specific chord voicing associated with them. That's wild.
It's also easier to play that way too. I mean, you don't have to do the huge hand. You have to spread your hand really wide.
It lays
to hit
under
that
the
9.
keys. Yeah. I guess I was unable to find where they exactly named this after. I found one forum reference where they said they jokingly named it after one of the opioid receptors in our brains, which as a way of like poking fun at a drug reference. But I wasn't able to find any verification of that.
I think it was a critic talking at the opening of the speaking in the opening of the classic albums documentary. I can't remember who, but I remember they were saying, the thing about Steely Dan is that they were not a pop band with prog jazzy pretensions, and they weren't jazz guys slumming it in the pop world. They really were trying to make this fusion's the only word I can think of. I mean, something that was really new, that was sort of in between. And speaking of, I feel like this chord, in a strange way, sums it up. I mean, if you were trying to do like serious hardcore jazz, you would have some really complex, like B flat major 7, with a 11th,
9,
yeah,
sharp
exactly.
11.
Something there.
Yeah.
These are fairly common major chords that you'd find in all sorts of run-of-the-mill pop songs, with a little extra something just to make it pop, a little something different. And that's Steely Dan. That's the fusion. That's the middle ground.
Speaking of insane charts, Asia, the song, took 3 music stands to hold the 16 pages of notated music for each one of the guys who played on this. Incredibly, it came together in less time they allotted for it. They planned to rehearse an entire day before going to record it, but they changed their mind after getting through one rehearsal take of this. Becker told a guy whose, I guess, official title is Steely Dan historian, Brian Sweet, in 2011, he said, Steve Gadd, being a fantastic drummer, is a fantastic sight reader and didn't really need to rehearse. Neither did the rest of the band. Gadd took, I've heard, 2 takes to record his solos that take up the break in that song. First ever drum solo in a Steely Dan song, edited together in the final mix. And I guess Becker's only, just like Play the Blues, Becker's direction to him was just play like hell. And I guess his playing was so crazy in the studio that the other musicians stopped looking at their own charts and were just like drawn to him and up their own takes, which tracks. Yeah. Months later, this is so funny. Ultimate Classic Rock has this feature when they were mixing. Gary Katz told Ultimate Classic Rock that he was playing these mixes because as you recall, this took 137 years to mix. Gary Katz said he was mixing this and played Steve Gadd the song Asia, which Steve Gadd played and soloed on. And Steve Gadd was like, wow, those drums sound great. Who plays on that?
Did he really, or was he just looking for compliments?
Well, who knows? Who's to say?
The hilarious thing to me is that Becker and Fagan, I guess, didn't like Steve Gadd's playing at first. They thought it wasn't laid back enough. And it's interesting, their thoughts on, we talked earlier about how they didn't want slap bass because it was too in vogue at the moment and just felt too showy. But I guess their thoughts on drumming during this period were really influenced by disco. They really kind of liked this rigid lockstep tempo of disco drummers. Donald Fagen told GQ UK in 2014, they had all these records that were just whack, so perfect. The beat never fluctuated. And we didn't see why we couldn't have that too, except playing this incredibly complicated music. And the drummer would go and play a great fill or something and come exactly back at the perfect beat at the same tempo.
Yeah. It's funny because, all these guys are a great example of how you can play in time, but place the beat differently. Like, Bernard Purdie is a metronomic drummer, but he's a little bit further back. Steve Gadd is a metronomic drummer, but he's a little bit on the beat, maybe even pushing a little. He's just such a clinic in musicianship, this f***ing record. Speaking of that, saxophonist Wayne Shorter, along of his own career as a leader in the jazz world, but also of the aforementioned second great Miles Davis quintet. He initially declined to play the solo in this song when Fagen and Becker reached out to him, but they asked Dick LaPalme, who's the manager of the Village Recorder, where they were recording this. I guess he knew Wayne Shorter from when Wayne Shorter was playing at Weather Report, and they were like, can you put in a good word for us? And Dick LaPalme was basically like, to Wayne Shorter was like, these guys are jazz dorks. Like, it'll really make their day if you come in and play on their little record, their cute little record. And they sent him a chart. And when he got to the studio, he warmed up, not on his saxophone, but by playing scales on the piano for half an hour, which I love. And he's got this very short part in the Classic Albums documentary, but he talks about how he found them corny because they were so nice to him. I guess because in the neighborhood where he grew up in, and also with Miles Davis, and he's one of these guys who just does a Miles Davis impression, like unprompted. He says Miles Davis is like, "You can't give everything away. Don't give everything away." Yeah, and so he was like, "Oh, these guys are weird. They're being too nice to me." Because La Palme says that Donald Fagen had been showing up in t-shirts and like jeans, and then when Wayne Shorter was there to play, he showed up in a starched white shirt, which is adorable.
It's the only person he was ever nice to.
I know, right? They wanted Tony Williams to drum on this song, and Tony Williams is also a member of the Second Great Quintet, which would have made between them and Victor Feldman 3 Miles Davis sidemen on this record, which I think is amazing. Dick LaPalme also tells this amazing story about an engineer at the studio by the name of Lenise Bent, who came to him one morning and asked to be taken off of these sessions because Becker and Fagen had spent 6 hours the previous night choosing comping takes for the phrase, "well, the." Just a 2-word phrase in the song Home at Last. The full lyric is, "Well, the danger on the rock has surely passed." And she told him, "Dick, I'm gonna do the voice. Dick, I gotta get off the Asia session." They worked on the words, "well, the," for 6 hours last night. All they did was work those 2 words for hours. I gotta get off the session. Hilariously, in that GQ article, it's claimed that they spent 4 days on it, not 6 hours. Anyway, Palm told Ben he convinced her to stay because she was like, "You're going to be working on an iconic album," and he was right.
Must have been even worse for Donald Fagen because I guess he, like a lot of artists, says that he hates the sound of his own voice. So he had to listen to himself sing those 2 words for somewhere between 6 hours and 4 days. He used to request that his scratch vocals be turned down when they were listening to early playbacks of the demos because he just didn't want to hear himself. And John Lennon was another one who hated his vocals too. That's why a lot of his solo stuff is all drenched with that Elvis-y slapback. He just always wanted some kind of effect on his voice because he just hated how he sounded.
Is it the Leslie on Tomorrow Never Knows?
Well, that was more because he wanted to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop. That was more specific. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Apparently, this Lenise person isn't the only one who couldn't deal with Becker and Fagen's brand of perfectionism. I guess when it came time to mix, an engineer named Bill Schnee just couldn't handle the constant, "what about this? What about that?" Again, this was remixed 13 times in 5 months. And he later said, "It became very obvious that we were both getting frustrated. And in the end, we just shook hands. And I said, 'Good luck with it, guys. It's going to be a great album.'" Which is...
Good night and good luck.
Yeah, exactly. I have a question for you. More of a dumb thought experiment than a question. This was recorded on 24-track, 2-inch tape on a capstanless machine, which kept the tape even more crisp because prior to this, tape had to be dragged across the little metal tape head, which inevitably degrades the tape to some degree. So much of the sound of this record, I assume, you would know better than I, is because they had so many tracks. They could, mic up the drum kit with 6 or 7 different mics, make the mix incredibly precise because they had all these tracks to make like, okay, this is a track just for, the kick drum or something. I mean,
right.
How do you think Steely Dan would have sounded if they were making records a decade earlier on like a 4-track?
I mean, I don't know. I think you can. Some of my favorite sounding records of all times are those Blue Note records that are, or like the Rudy Van Gelder stuff, recorded in, I think Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. He was like a famously engineered a lot of those jazz records. And I'll say that I think they could have gotten those scratch track or the basic tracks, like the rhythm tracks and everything, like really good. But no, you can't bury a trash can lid in the mix on a tape recording the same way you can digital. Anyway, there you go. Short answer, no with an if. Long answer, yes with a but.
Now, I'm nowhere near as proficient in music theory as you are, but purely from a listener's perspective, I want to talk about the chord changes on this record because they're
Insane.
unusual and
insane.
unexpected. We talked a bit about this on the Hey Ya episode, but there are certain stock phrases and progressions used in Western music that give you a sense of where the melody and the chords are heading. And after hearing music all of our lives, it just becomes second nature. And, we just can intuit where a song's going to go when we hear a pattern. We're humans. We look for patterns. And the most interesting songs are the ones that surprise us by resolving in pleasing but unexpected ways. And the pleasing part's where it gets tricky because you often run the risk of coming up with something dissonant and ugly. But when it's done right, it's really amazing. And you see that again and again on Asia. Think of the title track, That I Run to You, that moment. That melody could go anywhere from there. There is no hint as to where the song could go in just that little short phrase. It's beautiful enough to lure you in, but it gives absolutely no indication whatsoever about where the song's going next, which keeps you interested and curious. And that's, all the best music.
It's really wild. That one in particular, just that phrase goes F, G, D flat, C. It moves a whole step and then a tritone and then a half step. And that's how this whole song goes. I mean, the progression moves in whole steps and then it moves in half steps and a tritone. It makes some of the most weirdly dissonant intervals.
Yeah, but it works.
Yeah.
Well, you
Steely Dan whips.
Well, yeah. I mean, just all the key shifts and unresolved changes give it this edge that keeps it from veering into Muzaki territory, which, again, at the top of the episode, is kind of a hazard given how precise the recordings are on this. That edge comes through not only in Fagen's idiosyncratic voice and his kind of dark lyrics, but also these unsettled, unresolved chord changes. I think it's really an important part of the blend. Unoriginal critics over the years have occasionally saddled Steely Dan with having popularized the so-called smooth jazz genre, subgenre, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, or at least showed that there was money in smooth jazz. And Fagen has a really fascinating insight on this in this Dylan Jones GQ piece that we keep citing. He cited Hate 19, which isn't on Asia, but it's still a huge song of theirs off of Gaucho. I just thought it was interesting to see this song through Donald Fagen's eyes and see the intention of these sonic tricks that he uses. He and Becker are always sort of reluctant to talk about the actual meaning of their lyrics, so this seemed like a rare moment of as close to candor as we're going to get. Fagen said, "A lot of the effects we got were intended to be comic, like Hey 19 from 1980's Gaucho. We were in our 30s, still saddled with these enormous sex drives and faced with the problem that you can no longer talk to a 19-year-old girl because the culture has changed." Yeah, that's why. That's set against an extremely polite little groove, and then the chorus is set to jazz chords, and when you play them on electric instruments, there's a flattening effect, a dead kind of sound, and it's scored for falsetto voices, which adds to the effect. To me, it's very funny. Other people find it nauseating.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
I don't know why, but I found this kind of sad. Denny Diaz, guitarist Denny Diaz, solo on Asia, is the last time any founding member of the band played on one of their records.
That's right. Yeah, he was the guy who started the band and invited Becker and Fagen in, and they
kicked him out. By their own admission, they took over the band.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that for the earlier part of their career, they really did view themselves as a proper band. And it wasn't until like 74 with Katie Lyde that they shifted to mostly studio players. I just assumed they were always sort of a faceless studio group. Did Becker and Fagen play anything on Gaucho?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's kind of a blind spot for me. As I mentioned, I really liked Can't Buy a Thrill. I don't know a ton about Gaucho.
The title track, for my money, is one of the worst songs they ever did. It sounds like the Family Ties theme to me. Like, it seems like an 80s sitcom theme. I've never liked that album, or I've never liked that song. It's got some good songs on it. Actually, really just Babylon Sisters and Hey 19, now that I look at it.
And Denny Diaz, though, dude. Bodhisattva. to me is his triumph. I mean, my God, dude rips. Anyway, so speaking of names, what's in a name? Speaking of names, where the hell does Asia come from? The most commonly accepted explanation, the one that I've seen Fagin giving the most often, is that it was the name of a Korean woman who married the brother of one of his high school friends. But the most that I've been able to pin down of that word in Korean is as a sort of like repeated phrase, like a sports cheer. Like you would say Asia, Asia in Korean at the end of like a long sports chant. It's kind of like bring it on, or like come get me, or if you're like a soccer hooligan, like come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, like that sort of a thing. But as a name,
is come and have a go if you think you're hard
come
enough?
and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Yeah, it is actually. There's a great werewolf movie called Dog Soldiers, and one of the guys is like a lower class hooligan character, and he says that to one of the werewolves. And I Googled it because I didn't know if it was like, I thought it was just a line from that movie. Apparently it is like a thing, like Northern English, Irish, and Scottish soccer hooligans yell to other hooligans. Anyway, pinning the origins down of Asia as a name is trickier. According to names.org, multiple people peg it as an African word that means high priestess, while one person from Croatia said it means night bird. Which is really funny to me because Donald Fagen's well-regarded solo album containing the hit IGY is called The Nightfly. One of these other baby naming etymology sites, mom.com, has it originating from the Greek to mean forest goddess. Babynames.com IDs it as being of Indian origin and meaning to drive or propel, from which apparently derives its idiomatic translation in Hindu, and perhaps its literal translation in Sanskrit to mean goat. Just think about if Asia was just called goat.
I mean, many people would say that Steely Dan are goats.
Sure. Well, after all of that, perhaps racistly, the cover photo doesn't even feature anyone Korean. It's the Japanese people. It was shot by a Japanese photographer named Hideki Fujii. The woman on the cover is a Japanese model named Sayoko Yamaguchi, who was named one of the 6 top fashion models in the world by Newsweek. The year the record came out, didn't know Newsweek was keeping track of that, but that is their second appearance in this podcast. Friend of the pod, Newsweek. Asia Brown, who's the mayor of Compton in California, was apparently named after this song. Since her mom was a fan of Steely Dan. Well, 2020 WNBA MVP with the Las Vegas Aces, Asia Wilson, told an interviewer that on NPR that she was named after the song because it was her dad's favorite. So there's that.
Also, Asia Pecknold, who's Robin Pecknold's sister and manager of Fleet Foxes.
There you go. Three fucking Asias. Bet you didn't think you were getting that out of this. Convinced of this record's merit, Katz managed to persuade Fagen and Becker to do a little more work promoting this one. To wit, any work. Because they'd never done it before. But also taking a meeting with notorious power manager Irving Azoff. Is he a friend or an enemy of the pod?
Well, considering he's behind the one of the shows I'm working on, gonna say friend.
Well, a friend of the pod, Irving Azoff. He told
don't
Cameron
hurt my kneecaps.
Please don't kill me. Fagen told Cameron Crowe, "We were ready to blissfully go through life without a manager."
Yeah, Irving Azoff, huge power player. He managed the Eagles and was famously referenced by Don Henley with the immortal line, "He may be Satan, but he's our Satan."
Azoff's strategy for the record was simple but effective. He called all of his record store distributor buyer contacts and he offered them this album for $1 off the list price, but that they could still sell it for retail. I think in the article he says he offered to sell it to them at $6.98 and they could sell it at $7.98. And he said they all bought 2, 3, 4 times as many as normally. And I told them that offer would last 2 weeks. which worked. Give people a limited amount of time for a discounted price. That's just basic sales. Cameron Crowe asked him in that interview, he's like, hey, can you put me in contact with the guys? And Azov says, they could be anywhere. They haven't returned any calls in weeks. When those guys go underground, they disappear. I get no special privileges. They probably don't even realize they have a huge album.
They truly don't give a
Did
damn.
not give a shit.
No. They were notorious for hating interviews. When the record label requested that they up their profile, they responded by including a fake interview with each other as liner notes. Their whole persona is that they're, the original hipsters. They're precocious suburban kids on the hunt for weed, jazz, and beat literature. And you read interviews with them, unlike the rest of the music industry who try to prove how utterly sincere they are, they seem to almost get off by presenting themselves as insincere. And this shows up in their lyrics too. I mean, they're often dispassionate and sarcastic. And the writer Dylan Jones had this great line: Fagan always seemed like he was singing with one eyebrow raised. Which is,
my favorite is Reelin' in the Years. You've been telling me a genius since you were 17, and all the time I've known you, I still don't know what you mean.
Everybody knows that guy, though. Everybody knows somebody like that. Dylan Jones also calls Fagan a professional grouch. Yes, Fagan and Becker do not seem like likable people. They're just sneering at the world while spending ungodly amounts of money on their musical whims. Even during their time in LA recording, they were always extremely detached from the music scene. They rented houses out in Malibu away from everyone. They privately referred to LA as Planet Stupid, which I find hilarious. They claimed that they would always consider themselves New Yorkers because, as Fagan later told Musician Magazine, New York is the depository for misfit Americans. There's a reason that we're here and why we don't live in Cincinnati. And Steely Dan just basically perfectly fused West Coast cool with East Coast cynicism. As one critic said, they're the Eagles meets Woody Allen.
I love that.
Fair. Yeah, very fair. And this is probably why they never wore the mantle of fame very easily. It just went against their whole psyche. They kind of needed to be the wise guys at the back of the class that were just making fun of everybody. Steely Dan have often been described as a major band behaving like they were a cult act, which I feel like is a very telling way to view their canon. And maybe that was the secret to their success. It made people feel cool by listening to them. I never did, but...
Asia was, in fact, huge, at least on their standard of success. Within 3 weeks of coming out, it had reached the top 5 of the Billboard 200, ultimately peaked at number 3 to become the band's highest peaking album on the chart, eventually going double platinum.
I read on Spin that it was their only album to break 1 million copies, which I find really surprising, but... I don't know. Again, I guess I can't imagine Katy Lied or Pretzel Logic going platinum, so maybe not.
I guess it might have been...
There have been singles and greatest hits.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like Can't Buy a Thrill, maybe, but that could have been singles, though, because Do It Again and
Reelin' in the Years.
Reelin' in the Years would have been singles, yeah. Anyway, Peg, the first single, nearly cracked the top 10, but stayed on the chart for 19 weeks, tying with Ricky Don't Lose That Number and Hey 19 as Steely Dan's longest-running chart hit. Deacon Blues, the second, cracked the top 20, and Josie went to number 26. Just a hilarious for instance of where Steely Dan found themselves at the time. The Village Voice's 1977 Paz and Jop poll, that was a critics only poll, right?
I think so.
It was the thing was just a survey of the top critical responses of the year. Asia went number 5 in 77, surrounded by Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, Elvis Costello's My Aim Is True, Graham Parker and the Rumor, The Jam, Television's Marquee Moon, the Ramones' Rocket to Russia, and the Talking Heads. So that's 3 icons of New York City downtown cool. One ground zero for UK punk.
And Graham Parker.
And also Graham Parker. Just if you wanted the illustration of how out of step they were.
There was a small dissenting note, though, from Robert Christgau, of course. He was a mostly positive review, but he described some of the riffs as too effing tasty.
He was correct.
Yeah. But you're right. This was the year of punk and disco, and it's hard to stress just how incredibly weird this album was for its time. Michael Duffy's review in Rolling Stone set the tone for many of the criticisms for this album and the band. Asia will continue to fuel the argument by rock purists that Steely Dan's music is soulless and by its calculated nature antithetical to what rock should be. How do you feel about that?
It is not rock music.
Okay.
But, like, I don't think they're...
I mean,
it's not rock
is this
music.
rock in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame definition of
yeah, I mean, it's not Chuck
popular
Berry.
music?
It's not Chuck Berry, dude, but, like, it's got a backbeat. I mean...
You can dance to it. I give it an 8.
The kids can... It's got a beat and the kids can dance to it. No, I mean, interestingly, it is a very... They are sort of frozen in time because they are very much the white hipster revolution of the 50s, exemplified by like Norman Mailer and William Burroughs and the Beats. But they also got like, you know, real deal black musicians to play on these records, man. I mean, they have fucking
Purdy.
Chuck Rainey and Bernard Pretty Purdy and Wayne Shorter. Like, those are their peers just in black music. So in a way, they are what rock and roll was. Like, they are a fusion of white culture and black culture. And yeah, it's very clinical, but I don't know. That's what it is. And this was only like 20 years after rock became a thing. I mean, it's also, you know, I thought about this in the Grease thing. Like, I feel like rock and roll, as we really think of it as a uniquely American thing, doesn't really get codified until the 60s. Like, a lot of 50s rock and roll is still extraordinarily white because it's coming from country music and rockabilly. Like, we didn't really I mean, like, everyone talks about Rocket 88 and everyone talks about, like, you know, soul music and doo-wop, but like those things don't really get integrated until
that was
the
race
60s.
music.
Yeah, exactly. It was completely separate. That stuff really doesn't get integrated until the 60s. You know? Right? Am I out of pocket in saying that?
No, that's fair. I think towards the late 50s it started to cross over a little bit more, but I mean, you'd see it in things like The Girl Can't Help It, that I should check this, but the first big budget rock movie, the one with Jane Mansfield and Tom Yule, where it was like big Technicolor widescreen kind of deal. And you had, I mean, Little Richard did the theme for that. And so, I mean, that was a big Hollywood movie. So, I mean, you started by the end of the decade, started seeing it more Ed Sullivan, the nightly Sunday night variety show type stuff. But yeah, I mean, your point's well taken. It was definitely.
I mean, it's still 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
You know? Anyway, the only Grammy this record won out of its many nominations was for engineering, which is, you know, funny considering, as we talked about earlier, it was for years the preferred demo disc of high-end stereo shops everywhere. And I must always, as I always do, note that in 2010, the Library of Congress selected Asia for preservation in the National Recording Registry. I always just think that's funny.
You do,
I mean,
yeah.
it's Steely Dan is in the Library of Congress.
Well, I have a brief It Belongs in Museum segment. Apparently, the masters for the title track of Asia and Black Cow have gone missing. And that makes it impossible to do surround sound versions of these tracks. And I imagine it makes it really tough to remix, too. In the liner notes for the stereo remaster of the Asia album in 1999, Steely Dan offered a $600 reward for information leading to their return. Oh,
Seems like so little.
Yeah, that's like Lorne Michaels like offering the Beatles $3,000 to reunite. Like that's almost seems insulting. You touched on this at the top of the episode, but I was really unaware of the anti-Dan sentiment, or at least that it was as strong as it was. The Pitchfork review for 2000's Two Against Nature was pretty savage. It opens with, if you're a regular Pitchfork reader, why are you even so curious about Steely Dan in 2000? Before concluding with, people fought and died so our generation could listen to something better than Steely Dan. Dude, who fought and died? Okay.
Well, there's the 40-year Virgin line, too, about where they come after Michael McDonald for Yamo Be There. If I have to hear Yamo Be There one more time, I'm going to Yamo burn this place to the ground. I love Michael McDonald, dude. Why didn't you task me to do a Michael McDonald impression?
Oh, can you? We'll do it.
Well, there's
Well, now you're choking.
well, yeah, now I'm choking.
Yeah.
I just go, "Peg,
Yeah, you did
back
that.
to you. Saw the movie, foreign movie. Peg." Just the Rick Moranis SCTV bit where he's like, he's like literally driving from studio to studio just to like belly up to a mic and be like, oh.
I told you my Michael McDonald story.
I don't think so. No, I don't know
Really?
this.
Oh man,
No.
I thought I told you this. He had gotten back with the Doobie Brothers, or he was singing with the Doobie Brothers. I don't know which, and they were going on tour. And
Taking it to the streets.
Yeah. Yeah. And
They were, in fact, taking it to the streets.
They were, exactly. And I was interviewing all of them, and whatever the lead guy from the Doobie Brothers, he was in a pissy mood, and he kept like, I would ask a question, and he would always intentionally like misinterpret it to try to like, I don't know, just he wanted an excuse to go off on somebody and to like put somebody in their place. And I was like 23, and I'd spent days researching them, as I always do, and I knew what I was talking about, but for some reason he was just in a bad mood. And then finally, after this happening like 3 times, Michael McDonald was like, "Come on, Tom, you know what he meant."
Aw.
And then he like went up to me afterwards and like kind of like was extra nice to me, which I took as an apology, which was very nice.
I love that so
Yeah.
much.
No, he was really sweet.
Sweet Michael McDonald. Oh, that makes me love him so much. Anyway, though hipster critical appraisal of the album has swung back around with a new generation of musicians, notably Mac DeMarco. When I saw Mac DeMarco at Pitchfork Festival, he just closed his set with just the outro section of Reelin' in the Years. Like he
Did
played
he play
all of
it
his
or
hits.
just through the PA?
No, he played all of his hits, and then the whole band just went into the banana, like just the outro. The
That's
outro section.
awesome.
It was incredible. Anyway, for a long time, the biggest shadow this record cast in popular music was a treasure trove of samples. Peg was sampled by De La Soul for their iconic 1989 record 3 Feet High and Rising.
Yeah, that's how a lot of DJs, I think Mark Ronson, as being one of them, first came across Steely Dan.
And Black Cow famously sampled. Do you know did you grow up drinking Black Cows?
No, actually, surprisingly, that's a bit of like mid-century Americana kitsch.
That's a thing my parents
diner.
did. I grew up, Coke and milk or root beer and milk, black or brown cow. It's like a soda fountain thing.
Oh, I thought it was like a root beer float, but instead of root beer, it was Coke. Although I guess it's a regional difference thing. I've heard both.
Yeah, I think you do milk instead of just ice cream, so it's not like it's
okay.
not like the solid ice cream. It's just anyway, sampled twice prominently, once by Beyonce on the J-Ty remix of 2004's "Me, Myself, and I," and once more famously and more depressingly by for the song "Deja Vu, Uptown Baby" by Lord Tariq and Peter Guns. In exchange for clearing the use of that sample, Steely Dan requested not just $115,000 up front, but 100% of publishing royalties, which makes them the sole credited songwriters on that song.
Peter Guns called this a stick-up, which, yeah.
It's not wrong. Fagan told GQ that Tariq and Guns technically also stole the sample from another hip-hopper. So, quote, the sample had already been licensed for Puff Daddy and Maze, which is really funny to me because this would have been right around the whole Puff Daddy and Maze cultural dominance moment.
Yeah.
Fagan goes on, we actually heard that Puff Daddy was riding around in a limo with Lenny Kravitz and went crazy when he heard it, saying they stole my sample. That's my version of a Peter Jackson 8-hour documentary. I need 8 hours on Puff Daddy and Lenny Kravitz riding around in a limo in 1997 being upset that their Steely Dan sample was taken out from under their feet.
And I guess Becker and Fagan were given an award from ASCAP for this Peter Guns song that they didn't actually write. But ASCAP suggested they stay home and mail them the plaques because there had been some violence the year before, and they were basically afraid that Peter Guns would have some kind of clash with Puff Daddy and Maze, or maybe he would clash with Becker and Fagan. I don't know, but
honestly, that would be a hilarious, sad postscript to Steely Dan if they were shot to death in 1997 by a one-hit wonder hip-hop band. Though there are dozens of other examples, probably the most famous dance sample in recent memory was Kanye West pulling Kid Charlemagne for 2007's Champion. Although that beat was actually built by his producer, Brian Alday Miller. There's a really cute story behind this. Fagan said, Kanye actually sent us a sample of his tunes, and frankly, Walter and I listened to it, and although we'd love some of the income, neither of us particularly liked what he had done with it. We said no at first. Then he wrote us a handwritten letter that was kind of touching about how the song was about his father, and he said, I love your stuff, and I really want to use it because it's a very personal thing for me. It was such a good letter, we said, all right, go ahead, and we made a deal with him.
Aw. Well, the only person that Becker and Fagan have been nice to other than Wayne Shorter, it's Kanye.
Sadly, Walter Becker passed away in 2017 at 67 of esophageal cancer. The New York Times wrote in his obit that with Steely Dan, Becker changed the vocabulary of pop in the 1970s, and tributes to him poured in from artists as wide-ranging as Mac DeMarco, Beck, Questlove, Nile Rodgers, the Mountain Goats, John Darnielle, Best Coast, Bethany Cosentino, Jason Isbell, Talib Kweli, and producer Just Blaze.
On the other end of the spectrum, they've also been praised by Judd Apatow, who's called them a bottomless pit of joy. Yet, I cannot imagine that Donald Fagen gives a damn about any of this.
Nope.
Once a Milwaukee reporter asked him, or forced is the word I actually see used more often, Becker to listen to Grizzly Bear, who are a group who've cited Steely Dan as a major influence. Becker did and pronounced them, quote, horrible, and said that he should, quote, drop science on them. Which I don't even fully get what that means, but that's brutal all the same. He can be vicious. When Rolling Stone asked him to keep a diary for his trip to Coachella, he wrote, after hearing a few bands, I noticed that many of them sounded a lot like the folk rock bands of the 60s that were born in the wake of Bob Dylan's Electric Switchover, only louder and dumber. At least hip-hop, which is tough for me to listen to, has got a few genuine eccentrics with street energy and something to say.
In Fagen's own tribute to his creative partner, he wrote that Becker was smart as a whip, an excellent guitarist and a great songwriter, and he added that while Becker was cynical about human nature, including his own, he was hysterically funny, adding that he had the knack of creative mimicry, reading people's hidden psychology and transforming what he saw into bubbly, incisive art. As far as Fagen is concerned, that is practically a full-on grab the handkerchief, snot-nosed, tearful Oscars tribute.
Yeah.
The aforementioned missile defense consultant and guitarist Jeff Skunk Baxter quipped in 1995, a band like Steely Dan couldn't get arrested today. He was right. William S. Burroughs, who you will remember the band named themselves after a sex toy in Burroughs' Naked Lunch, was asked about Steely Dan in 1977. He says, these people are too fancy. They're too sophisticated. They're doing too many things at once in a song.
That should have been their greatest hits title.
Too many things at once?
In a song, yeah.
I love this quote from Walter Becker. He was talking to Time Out in New York in 2011. He said, that's sort of what we wanted to do. Conquer from the margins. That's a good Steely Dan lyric.
Back of the class.
Find our place in the middle based on the fact that we were creatures of the margin and alienation. And I think that's why I love this band and this record so much. There's such a perversity to these two weirdos who were so close enough that they seemingly shared a brain, and they crafted all of these airtight songs with a rotating cast of some of the best musicians in the world, all grounded within their little neurotic world of jazz and sex creeps and higher education literature. And they might have been weird cranks who I wouldn't have wanted to spend a second with, but they were consummate artists, and I am so happy that the world has caught up to that view of them. As they sang in Reelin' in the Years, you wouldn't even know a diamond if you held it in your hand. The things you think are precious, I can't understand. Thank you for listening, folks. This has been Too Much Information. I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. We'll catch you next time.
Too Much Information was a production of iHeartRadio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The supervising producer is Mike Johns,
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl.
with original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.